Right now, something is happening inside your head that no one can explain. Not your doctor, not the world's best neuroscientist, not a single human being alive. You are having an experience. There's something it feels like to be you reading these words right now, and nobody knows why. The hard problem. In 1995, a philosopher named David Chalmers pointed at the elephant in the room. He said, look, we're getting pretty good at explaining how the brain does stuff, how you pay attention, how you tell red from blue, how you report what you're feeling. Those are what he called the easy problems. Not because they're easy, but because at least we know what kind of answer we're looking for. But then there's the other thing. Why does any of this feel like anything from the inside? Why aren't you just a biological robot processing inputs and outputs in the dark? That's the hard problem of consciousness. Chalmers had a thought experiment. Imagine a being that is atom for atom identical to you. Same brain, same neurons. It walks like you, talks like you. But inside, nothing. No experience. Lights on, nobody home. That's a philosophical zombie. And if you can even conceive of one existing, it suggests consciousness might not just be a physical process, which is, to put it mildly, a problem for science. Not everyone buys it. Daniel Dennett basically called the whole thing a confusion. But Chalmers and others insist the gap is real and possibly permanent. And this isn't even a new headache. Philosophers have been banging their heads against this wall for over 1,000 years, so where do we even start looking for answers? Well, the obvious place. Inside the brain itself. Neural correlates. So if consciousness is this big mystery, where do we even start looking for it? The brain, obviously. But where in the brain? In 1990, Francis Crick and Christoph Koch asked a deceptively simple question. What is the smallest neural circuit required for you to consciously see the color red? Not think about red, not react to red, but actually experience redness. They called whatever that circuit turns out to be the neural correlate of consciousness, or NCC. Basically, the minimum brain activity needed for a specific conscious experience to happen. So where does it live? Here's where it gets weird. Your cerebellum, the little wrinkly thing at the back bottom of your brain, contains more neurons than the rest of your brain combined. And yet people with cerebellar damage don't lose consciousness. You can scoop that thing out and someone will still experience the world just fine. More neurons does not mean more consciousness. Congratulations, neuron count is meaningless here. Instead, the leading candidate is a posterior hot zone, basically the back of your brain, where the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes meet. Activity there seems to track what you're actually experiencing moment to moment. But here's where scientists start fighting. Integrated information theory says consciousness lives in those sustained posterior representations back of the brain, global neuronal workspace. Theory says no, consciousness happens when information gets broadcast across the brain through frontoparietal ignition events front of the brain. Two theories, opposite predictions. A study using intracranial electrodes in 31 patients, over 1,300 electrodes total, found sustained object identity information in posterior cortex but not in prefrontal cortex. Score 1 for the back of the brain. Oh, and the thalamus. It's not generating consciousness so much as gatekeeping it, relaying and modulating signals to cortical areas that do the heavy lifting, so we've got aware. But consciousness isn't just about location, it's also about being awake enough to have experiences in the first place. Levels of arousal and wakefulness. So we've been talking about what consciousness looks like from the outside, the neural correlates. But here's a more basic question. What actually keeps the lights on? Because it's not your cortex. Your cortex is the screen, not the power button. The thing that actually switches you on is a network buried deep in your brainstem called the Ascending Reticular Activating System, or ARAS. It's a collection of tiny nuclei, the locus coeruleus, the raphe nuclei, the lateral hypothalamus, which releases a chemical called orexin to keep you awake. Together, they send a constant upward signal that tells your cortex to stay active. Cut that signal, and the whole cortex goes dark. Doesn't matter how healthy the rest of your brain is, this is so fundamental that brainstem lesions to ARAS components are part of the formal criteria for brain death. No upward signal, no you. And the clinical reality of losing that signal is brutal. More than 85% of adults who enter a coma from non-traumatic injury die within 1 month. Chances of a good or moderate recovery drop from roughly 7% at day 3 to about 2% by day 14. But here's what makes this genuinely disturbing. The main tool doctors use to assess whether someone is conscious, the Glasgow Coma Scale, misclassifies approximately 38% of conscious patients as vegetative. Nearly 4 in 10 people who are actually aware get flagged by the system as not aware. There's a better tool, the Coma Recovery Scale Revised, which catches more minimally conscious conscious patients. But adoption has been slow, which means right now, treatment decisions, life and death decisions are being made with a tool that gets it wrong more than a third of the time. So arousal is the foundation. But once the lights are on, what happens when you mess with the signal? Altered states. So we've talked about consciousness going up and down, like a dimmer switch. But what happens when you don't just dim it or brighten it, you rewire the whole lamp? Let's start with psychedelics because the numbers here might surprise you. As of 2023, there were 96 registered clinical trials on psilocybin, 112 on MDMA, and 132 on LSD. That's not a handful of rogue scientists in a basement. That's mainstream psychiatry taking this stuff seriously. And what psychedelics reliably do to the brain is fascinating. You know, that default mode network we mentioned, the brain's background narrator that's always going me, 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 me. Psychedelics turn that down. They reduce the functional connectivity within the default mode network while cranking up sensory and thalamocortical connectivity. Basically, your brain's usual architecture loosens up and lets more raw sensory input through. It's like removing the filter on a camera. Everything gets more vivid, more connected, and way more overwhelming. But psychedelics aren't the only way to mess with the settings. Between 5 and 20% of people report out-of-body experiences, and they can be triggered by trauma, epilepsy, sleep disorders, or psychedelics. Here's the wild part. Researchers can induce them on demand by electrically stimulating specific brain regions, the anterior precuneus, and the temporoparietal junction. You can literally flip a switch and make someone feel like they're floating above their own body. In a lab. On a Tuesday, meditation is measurable too. A meta-analysis of 141 studies found medium effect sizes for changes in brain activation, with Cohen's d-values around 0.59 and negative 0.74. In a field known for tiny, barely there effects, that's meaningful. Hypnosis is even more concrete. Across 85 trials with over 3,600 participants, hypnotic analgesia produced effect sizes between 0.54 and 0.76, with clinically significant pain reduction, especially for highly suggestible individuals. That's not placebo. That's your brain literally deciding pain is optional. Now, caveat time, the field is messy, small sample sizes, methodological variability, and mechanisms that differ wildly across altered states mean the headlines often sprint ahead of the data. But the empirical foundation is real, it's growing, and it's telling us something important. Consciousness isn't one fixed thing. It's flexible, it bends. So if consciousness can be altered, dimmed, expanded, and rewired, the next question is obvious. Who's doing the experiencing? What even is a self? Self-consciousness and ego. So some creatures don't just experience the world, they experience themselves experiencing the world. But how do you test for that? You put a mirror in front of an animal and secretly mark its face with a dot. If it sees the dot in the mirror and reaches up to touch its own face, it understands that the reflection is itself. If it tries to fight the mirror or ignores it, it doesn't. That's the mirror self-recognition test, and it's the closest thing we have to a standardized test for self-awareness. About 75% of young adult chimpanzees pass it. Bonobos, orangutans, and gorillas pass it too. Bottlenose dolphins pass it without hands. They twist and angle their bodies in front of the mirror to inspect marked areas, which is honestly kind of showing off. But here's where it gets weird. The Eurasian magpie, a bird, also passes the test. A bird. With a brain structured completely differently from any mammals. No neocortex, no primate-style neural architecture, just a totally alien brain arriving at the same result. That single finding reframes the whole question. Self-recognition doesn't require a specific type of brain. It requires something we don't fully understand yet. But here's the problem. The mirror test measures one very specific thing: body image recognition. Can you identify your own reflection? That's it. It doesn't tell you whether a dolphin plans for next Tuesday, or whether a magpie has an internal narrative about its life, or whether a chimp has anything resembling what humans mean when they say ego. It's a useful proxy, not a complete picture, and public interpretation tends to fly off the rails in both directions. Either animals are basically people, or it's just a reflex, it doesn't count. The truth is more nuanced and, honestly, more interesting than either extreme. So we've been talking about what consciousness looks like from the inside, what it feels like to be aware, to recognize yourself. But what about all the stuff your brain does that you never become aware of at all? Phenomenological intentionality. Here's something that sounds obvious, but is actually a deep philosophical philosophical claim. You can't just be conscious. You're always conscious of something. Right now, you're conscious of this video. Before that, maybe your phone, maybe a sandwich, maybe the slow, creeping dread of an unanswered email. Consciousness is always pointed at something. It's always about something. Philosophers call this intentionality. And no, it doesn't mean doing something on purpose. It means every experience you have is an experience of something. Consciousness doesn't just sit there idling like a car in a parking lot. It's always aimed. Now here's where it gets interesting. Philosophers split consciousness into two flavors. The first is access consciousness, which is information being available to your brain for reasoning, decision making, and talking about it. You see a red apple, your brain registers red, apple, edible, and you can report that to someone. The second is phenomenal consciousness, which is what it actually feels like to see the red. That warm, vivid redness filling your visual field. These two usually travel together, but they're not the same thing. And that distinction matters enormously when you start asking whether an AI or a fish is conscious. A system might have access consciousness, processing and reporting information without any phenomenal experience at all. Or maybe not. That's the debate. And neuroscience actually gives us a measurable window into when phenomenal content shows up. When you see something, a negative electrical deflection appears over the back of your brain, posterior and lateral occipital cortex, between 100 and 300 milliseconds after the stimulus. That tiny window is the measurable signature of content entering conscious experience. Specific neuron populations in the posterior hot zone light up for specific things. The neurons involved when you consciously see a face are a distinct subset from those involved when you see a place. Your brain doesn't just say I'm seeing, it says I'm seeing this. The big open question is whether this aboutness, this intentionality, is fully explainable by those access and functional processes, or whether it's something extra that needs its own explanation entirely. In other words, is the unconscious of something just neurons doing their job, or is it a whole separate mystery sitting on top? So far, we've been talking about what consciousness does when it's on, but what about when it's off, or at least when it seems like it is? The unconscious and subconscious. Here's something that should genuinely unsettle you. There are people who are completely blind, clinically verifiably blind, in parts of their visual field due to damage in their primary visual cortex. They will tell you, with total sincerity, that they see nothing. But if you hold up an object and ask them to guess where it is, they get it right. Way more than chance. Ask them if a face is angry or happy, they'll nail it. They have no idea how. They insist they're guessing. They're not. Their brain is processing visual information, evaluating it, and feeding it into behavior, all without a single flicker of conscious awareness. This is called blind sight, and it's one of the most well-documented phenomena in neuroscience. Now scale that up. Sleepwalkers can execute complex, coordinated, goal-directed behavior while fully unconscious. We're not talking about bumping into furniture. There are documented cases of people driving cars while sleepwalking. Full routes, turns, and everything. No conscious perception, no memory of it afterward, and it's not just dramatic edge cases. Subliminal stimuli, things flash so fast you literally cannot report seeing them, still activate your amygdala, your hippocampus, your anterior cingulate, your insula, even your primary visual cortex. Meta-analyses confirm that people can discriminate these mass stimuli above chance. Your brain is evaluating information you never knew existed. So here's the big misconception. People think the unconscious is where the brain goes on break. It's not. It's where most of the work actually happens. Sensory input, emotional evaluation, behavioral preparation, all running in parallel with whatever you're consciously thinking about. The unconscious isn't the basement, it's the engine room. But there's a genuine measurement problem here. How do you reliably tell the difference between no conscious experience and conscious experience that just wasn't reported? That distinction is scientifically hard to nail down, which means the exact boundaries of unconscious processing are still contested. And if drawing the line between conscious and unconscious is this difficult inside a single human brain, imagine trying to figure out whether consciousness exists in something that isn't human at all. Panpsychism and cosmopsychism. Okay, so we've been assuming consciousness is something that emerges, you stack enough neurons together, wire them up just right, and boom, subjective experience pops out like toast from a toaster. But what if that's backwards? What if consciousness doesn't emerge from complexity? What if it's been there the whole time, baked into the fabric of reality itself all the way down to the smallest particle? That's panpsychism. The idea that mind, or at least some form of proto-experience, is a fundamental feature of the universe. Not something brains generate, but something everything has, at least a tiny sliver of. Now, before you dismiss this as stoner philosophy, consider who takes it seriously. Giulio Tononi and Christoph Koch, the neuroscientists who built integrated information theory, the most mathematically rigorous framework for consciousness we have openly acknowledged that their theory carries panpsychist implications. Meaning, if you follow I tease logic to its conclusion. Even simple systems with integrated information have some degree of experience. Rocks, thermostats, electrons. That's not a fringe blog post. That's the architects of the theory saying, yeah, this is where the math points. And the idea isn't new. Thales and Plato flirted with it. William James wrote about it. Alfred North Whitehead built an entire metaphysics around it. Thomas Nagel revived it in 1979. Galen Strawson pushed it further in 2006. It keeps coming back because physicalism keeps slamming into the hard problem, and panpsychism offers an escape hatch. If consciousness is fundamental, you don't have to explain how it emerges from non-conscious stuff. Problem dissolved. But here's the problem it creates. If electrons have proto-experience, how do billions of them combine into the unified, rich, conscious experience you're having right now? William Seeger named this the combination problem in 1995, and it remains genuinely unsolved. You've basically traded how does consciousness emerge from matter for how does micro-consciousness merge into macro-consciousness. Critics say that's not progress, that's just a lateral move from one mystery to another. And the evidence base, almost entirely philosophical. There's currently no empirical test that could confirm or falsify whether a rock has proto-experience, which is either a feature or a bug depending on how you feel about philosophy's role in science. So where does consciousness show up outside of human skulls? Animal and non-human consciousness. So we've been talking about consciousness like it's a human thing. But here's an uncomfortable biological fact. The molecular machinery your body uses to detect tissue damage, the nociceptors, the specific ion channels they rely on, those are ancient. Vertebrates share A delta and C fibers for nociception. Fish have them, frogs have them, your dog definitely has them. The hardware for pain-like signaling isn't some recent evolutionary luxury. It's hundreds of millions of years old, which means if you're using biology as your guide, the capacity for something like pain is not a human invention. It's a family inheritance. But having the wiring doesn't automatically mean something hurts, right? A smoke detector has sensors too, and nobody feels bad for it. So how do scientists actually test whether an animal experiences pain rather than just reflexively flinching? The gold standard is operant conditioning. If an animal will actively work to avoid a stimulus, if it will trade off food or shelter to escape something painful, that's not just a reflex, that's a choice. That's an animal saying this is bad enough that I'll give up something I want to make it stop. And across species, from rats to fish to octopuses, animals do exactly that. That kind of motivated avoidance is taken as evidence of effective felt pain, not just nociception firing in a vacuum. Then there's the self-awareness angle. Great apes, bottlenose dolphins, and the Eurasian magpie have all passed the mirror self-recognition test, showing self-directed behavior that suggests they have some form of self-related cognition. That's not just reacting to a reflection, that's recognizing that's me. Though what exactly that implies about inner experience is still debated, and that's the core problem, amplified. With humans, inferring consciousness from behavior is already tricky. With animals, the gap gets wider the more different the organism is from us. We can observe the biology, we can measure the behavior. But whether a fish feels pain the way you feel pain, that's an inference. A reasonable one, an increasingly well-supported one, but still an inference. And where you draw that line determines what you think is morally permissible in agriculture, in research, in captivity. The science doesn't give you a clean answer. It just makes comfortable certainty harder to hold on to. So if figuring out whether a dog or a fish is conscious is this difficult, imagine trying to answer the same question for something that isn't even biological. Artificial and machine consciousness. So can we build it? Can we engineer a conscious machine? Integrated information theory is currently the only framework that even tries to answer that with math instead of vibes. It assigns a value called phi to any system measuring how much integrated information that system generates. High phi, more consciousness. Low phi, lights are off. And here's where it gets weird. According to IIT, a standard computer, the kind running every AI you've ever interacted with, scores near zero. Doesn't matter how smart the output looks. Doesn't matter if it writes poetry or passes the bar exam. Von Neumann architecture processes information in a way that generates almost no integrated information. By this framework, today's most powerful AI systems are basically philosophical zombies. Sophisticated behavior, nobody home. But a neuromorphic chip, something engineered to integrate information the way biological brains do, could theoretically score high on phi and actually be conscious. So IIT predicts that consciousness isn't about intelligence or capability, it's about architecture. That inverts basically every popular intuition about machine consciousness. But here's the problem. We can't actually measure phi, not for real systems. The number of ways you'd have to partition a system to calculate exact phi grows combinatorially, kind of like Bell's number, which means for anything as complex as a brain or a modern processor, the math is computationally unreachable. Proxy metrics exist, things like empirical phi, phi star, geometric phi, and a newer one called psi that scales polynomially. But none of them have been validated against the real thing. Researchers are approximating a quantity they can't compute. Those proxies do show sensitivity to conscious states. Default mode network phi max drops during deep sedation and rebounds on recovery, but phi max values varied by roughly 62% across different neural networks in implementation studies. So the signal is real, but the noise is enormous. The framework exists. The measurement tools don't, and the stakes, whether the things we're building can suffer or experience, couldn't be higher. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.